Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. I am Diana and I am so glad you chose to tune in today. If you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. I would also love to hear from you in the comments below. Let me know what city you are listening from so I can see just how far our stories are traveling. My name is Evelyn Vance. For most of my adult life, I lived by a simple, grounding truth. If you work hard, tell the truth, and keep your head down, the world will treat you fairly. I had absolutely no reason to doubt it. At 47 years old, I was a senior forensic auditor for a mid-sized logistics firm in Austin, Texas. I owned a 3-bedroom vintage brick home in the suburbs of Georgetown, drove a 5-year-old Toyota SUV, and faithfully paid off my mortgage on the 12th of every single month. I had a 401k that I rarely checked, and a checking account that usually held no more than $5,000. I wasn't rich, but I wasn't struggling either. I was the exact type of person the massive global financial system completely overlooks. Predictable, reliable, and entirely invisible. My personal life was quieter than I like to admit. My ex-husband Arthur and I had been divorced for 8 years. Arthur was an entrepreneur in the green energy tech sector, and during the final 4 years of our marriage, he meticulously built a secret life that I knew nothing about. After the divorce, I was left with the house, the debt, and a lingering sense of caution around other people's motives. It was an uncomfortable armor to wear, but it felt familiar and safe. I had 2 close friends, Maria, an ER nurse I grabbed coffee with once a month, and David, my former auditing mentor who had since moved to Denver but texted more than anyone else I knew. I also had Chief, a retired racing greyhound. On weekends, I went to the farmer's market. I was doing just fine. The first sign that something was wrong came on a Tuesday in late October. I logged into my mobile banking app, Texas Interstellar Bank, just to make sure my automated bills had cleared. It was a habit I picked up during the divorce years, after Arthur drained our joint account twice without telling me. It was a brutal lesson, but it taught me that money vanishes the moment you stop watching it. I opened the app, clicked on my checking balance, and completely froze. The number on the screen read $38,512,000. I laughed. It was a short, sharp, confused sound that escaped my throat. I figured it was just a software glitch. I forced the app to close and opened it again. The number was still there. I tapped on the transaction history. The deposit had come through the night before, at 11:47 p.m. The memo line was incredibly brief, reading only, "Internal third-party escrow fund disbursement." There was no name, no reference number, and no explanation. For several minutes, I just sat there at my kitchen table, clutching my phone while my black coffee grew cold. $38.5 million. The number was so far outside the boundaries of my life that it didn't even feel real. It felt like a massive data entry error, a system stress test, or someone else's catastrophic mistake that had somehow been misrouted to my address. As someone who had spent 18 years working in forensic auditing and compliance, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. This was not my money. Somewhere out there, someone was frantically searching for $38.5 million, and they were going to do whatever it took to get it back. At 8:02 a.m., I called customer service. I navigated the automated menu, pressing 2 for account inquiries, and spent 4 minutes listening to a monotonous country guitar loop before a representative named Carter picked up. I gave him my name. I told him I was calling about an erroneous deposit. I read him the exact amount. There was a sudden pause on the line. It wasn't the brief silence of a customer service rep typing on a keyboard, or the routine hesitation of pulling up a file. It was a heavy, specific kind of quiet. It was the sort of oppressive silence that tells you, clear as day, that something is terribly wrong before the other person even speaks a word. Then Carter spoke in a very low, incredibly guarded voice. He said, "Ma'am, that transfer was not a mistake." A cold chill ran straight through my chest. I asked him what he meant by that. "I need to transfer you to our private wealth management division," he said. "Someone will reach out to you directly today." I tried to stop him, asking what he meant by it not being a mistake and wanting to know whose money it actually was. But he had already pushed the call through. The flat country guitar music started playing again. I sat completely still in my kitchen, listening to the loop, desperately trying to understand why a bank employee would go dead silent the moment he heard my name. The phone in private wealth management rang 7 times before hitting a voicemail. A calm, professional voice asked me to leave my name and number, promising someone would return the call within 1 business day. I left a message. My words were incredibly precise. My name, my account number, the exact amount of the deposit, and I repeated my phone number twice at the end. When I hung up, I looked over at Chief. He was lying in the morning sun by the kitchen island, watching me with a gentle, detached look, the kind of look only a creature who has never worried about money a day in his life could give. I told him it was going to be okay, but things were not okay. I went to work as usual. I dragged myself through a routine morning of document reviews and sat through a departmental meeting about fourth-quarter audit protocols for the supply chain, but I didn't absorb a single word. My mind was stuck back in my kitchen, staring at the number on my screen, 38,512,000. I had 18 years of experience in auditing. I knew exactly what happens when massive, unexplained sums of money move between accounts. I knew exactly what federal reporting thresholds looked like. I knew that the Bank Secrecy Act requires financial institutions to file a suspicious activity report for any unexplained transactions over $10,000. And I knew that a wire transfer of over $38 million, with no clear origin and no sender's name, was absolutely impossible to hide. What I didn't know was why that customer service rep had gone completely silent when he heard my name. That was the nightmare that kept clawing at the back of my mind all day long. By the time I drove home that evening, I was running through every possible explanation. A clearing error from another institution, an internal bank test for fraud detection, or a catastrophic mistake by a clerk in the wire room who scrambled a routing number and sent a legitimate transfer to the wrong account. Those were the logical theories. The kind of theories that usually end with a polite reversal, an official apology letter, and my account returning to its unimpressive balance of $4,219. But there was another category of explanations, one that I tried desperately to push away but kept falling back into. What if the money hadn't been sent to the wrong account at all? What if it had been sent to the exact right account, and someone had decided long ago to tie my name to this fortune? In my 18 years on the job, I had seen this play out. It had never happened to me, but I had seen it happen to others. Shell companies, layered transactions, fall guy accounts. People would find someone with clean credit and a spotless professional background, turning them into the perfect destination to hide money that needed to disappear. Usually, these fall guys were recruited, groomed, and agreed to it in exchange for a cut. But not always. Sometimes the choice was made without them knowing a thing. Sometimes the average, invisible people were chosen precisely because they were average and invisible, because nobody would ever look twice at them. And when the feds eventually investigated the paper trail, the real criminals could point to a living, breathing person and say, "She did it." I sat in my car in the driveway for a solid 20 minutes. If that money had been placed in my account intentionally, it meant someone already knew my full name, my bank, and my account number. They had either hacked the system to get it or bought it somewhere. They had enough high-level institutional access to execute a $38.5 million wire, and for some reason I hadn't figured out yet, they chose me. I forced myself to break down the stakes of what I was facing. If I did nothing and let the money sit there, I would be dragged into whatever scheme was behind it. Tax evasion, money laundering, wire fraud, structuring, these were all federal felonies. My career in auditing would be completely over. My house would be seized. I could face criminal charges. The fact that I hadn't asked for the money might matter in court, but it wouldn't automatically protect me. Not unless I had a rock-solid paper trail proving I had reported it immediately and cooperated fully with the authorities. And if I tried to spend it, a thought that crossed my mind for a split second before I completely crushed it, I would be committing a felony by knowingly using illicit funds. Absolutely not. If the bank was going to stonewall me, I had to build my own way out. I got out of my car and walked inside. I fed Chief. I brewed a cup of hot tea, but I didn't take a single sip. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and started writing. By 10 o'clock that night, I had the blueprint of a counteroffensive. It wasn't reckless or dramatic. It was calculated, meticulous, and handled exactly how a senior auditor solves a problem. I was going to weaponize a documented paper trail and bulletproof contingencies. Step 1 was sending a formal, written notice to the bank via certified mail to establish a legal record that I had reported the error immediately. Step 2 was contacting the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau to file an intake inquiry. Step 3 was hiring an attorney, and not sometime tomorrow afternoon. I needed one first thing in the morning. Step 4 was documenting absolutely everything, making sure every call, message, and transaction detail was backed up in 2 separate locations. Step 5 was the heaviest, most terrifying task of all, finding out who initiated the wire and why my name had already been flagged internally before I ever placed that call. By 8:15 the next morning, I was sitting in the office of Valerie Chow. Valerie was one of the top white-collar criminal defense attorneys in Austin. I had seen her name in industry publications for years, and I even attended a seminar where she broke down federal asset forfeiture laws with a terrifyingly calm precision. She looked like someone who knew every square inch of the federal courthouses in the Western District of Texas. I had called her at 7 in the morning, telling her I had an emergency involving a massive, unauthorized deposit and a bank that was acting incredibly shady. She told me to get to her office immediately. Her office was on the 18th floor of a downtown skyscraper overlooking the Colorado River, featuring a conference table longer than my entire kitchen. I sat across from her and laid out my yellow legal pad, screenshots, and the receipt for the certified mail I had dropped off at the local post office at dawn. I told her everything. Valerie listened without interrupting a single time. When I finished, she sat in silence for a moment, tapping her pen against her notepad. "You're an auditor," she said. It wasn't a question. 18 years of experience, so you already know this isn't a routine misrouted wire. "I know," I replied. "The way the representative went silent when you gave your name," she said, leaning forward. "That's the part that worries me most. It means your name was flagged. Not flagged for fraud, but flagged for routing. It means someone inside that institution, or someone with access to their systems, knew your name would be attached to this transfer." She used the exact word I had been fighting so hard not to say out loud, because hearing it made it entirely too real. An inside job. Someone inside the bank or with institutional clearance had cleared the way. The transfer hadn't come through normal wire channels. Valerie told me she would immediately file to get the SWIFT data and originating institution records. But the fact that a frontline customer service rep froze and immediately routed me to private wealth strongly suggested there were pre-existing instructions on how to handle a call from Evelyn Vance. Under Valerie's direction, I used her office computer to submit the CFPB complaint, which timestamped at 9:22 a.m. She then drafted a formal demand letter to Texas Interstellar Bank, giving them 10 business days to disclose the source of the transfer under federal banking statutes, or face an immediate escalation to the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. I walked out of her office with a legal folder, a retainer agreement, and my first real shield. At 11:47 a.m., a notification flashed on my phone. The bank had signed for the certified mail. At 2:15 that afternoon, my phone rang from an unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. The message was from a man named Richard Collins, who introduced himself as a senior vice president of private client services at Texas Interstellar Bank. His voice was smooth and unhurried, the tone of a high-level corporate operator who made a living smoothing over uncomfortable conversations. He said he understood my concerns regarding recent account activity and wanted to set up a time to sit down in person to clear up the situation. He never used the word error. He never offered to reverse the transfer. He just said he looked forward to hearing from you and left a direct line. I forwarded the audio file to Valerie instantly. 14 seconds later, she texted back, "Do not call him. Do not meet with anyone from that bank without me in the room." That night, I sat at my computer and did what I probably should have done the second I saw the balance. I searched my ex-husband's name. Arthur Vance's green energy startup Novatech had been the subject of a federal civil investigation 2 years ago. I had seen a brief article about it in the Austin Business Journal back then, but I hadn't dug into it. I had spent too much energy rebuilding a life where Arthur Vance didn't exist. But now, I ran a deep, systematic search. The investigation had been closed without charges, but I used the federal court database to pull the initial filings. Novatech had been involved in a complex web of transactions with a shell company called Apex Pioneer LLC. The sums of money were massive, and the routing was highly irregular. Deep inside a years-old SEC filing, I found the original incorporation documents for Apex Pioneer LLC. The registered agent listed on the paperwork was Victoria Sterling, Arthur's current wife and business partner, a cutthroat venture capitalist known in Los Angeles startup circles for being completely ruthless. I had never met Victoria. Arthur rarely spoke about her, and I had no idea what she looked like. Yet there her name was, stamped on a corporate entity tied directly to a company owned by the man who systematically deceived me during our marriage. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the cold clarity that only comes when you finally see the exact shape of the trap you are in. This wasn't a random glitch. I was targeted, and the people who chose me weren't strangers. By Thursday morning, Valerie formally filed a report with FinCEN and notified the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Western District of Texas. The filing stated that her client had received an unexplained transfer of $38,512,000, and that Texas Interstellar Bank had failed to provide documentation regarding the source of the funds, despite multiple legal requests. I wasn't there when she filed. Valerie told me to go to work, act completely normal, and stick to my routine. She told me that the most dangerous thing I could do right now was look like I was hiding. So I drove to the office. I reviewed supply chain compliance files. I ate lunch at my desk. During my break, I called Maria, using vague language we had agreed on to tell her I was dealing with a complicated financial issue. Maria said it sounded awful and offered to bring over some wine. I told her maybe next week. I hung up and stared out at the parking lot, doing my best to look like a person whose life was perfectly intact. The first real confrontation happened 4 days later. It didn't happen at my house. It happened in the parking lot of my local H-E-B grocery store after work. The Texas sun was setting, turning the sky a blinding, bloody red. I had just finished loading my groceries into the back of my Toyota when I heard a voice call my name. Evelyn! I turned around, and Arthur was standing just 5 paces away from my rear bumper. He looked older and more haggard than I remembered, with a thin layer of sweat on his forehead from stress. The high-flying Silicon Valley tech bro was gone. He looked like a man desperately trying not to drown. Knowing I lived in a one-party consent state, my hand slipped into my coat pocket and hit record on my smartphone by pure muscle memory. "What are you doing, Evelyn?" he demanded, skipping any pleasantries. His voice was frantic, humming with high-pressure anxiety. "You have no idea who you're dealing with. That money was just supposed to sit there temporarily. It belongs to some of the biggest funds in Silicon Valley. You're going to get everyone killed running to the feds." "The money isn't mine," I said, staring at him. My voice was surprisingly steady. "All you have to do is sign a backdated authorization stating the account was a designated escrow for bridge funding, and this all goes away." He stepped closer, a desperate, threatening look in his eyes. "If you let the FBI misinterpret this, Evelyn, things are going to get very, very ugly for you. Your pathetic auditor's salary can't afford the kind of lawyers you'll need to stay out of prison. I am trying to save you." "Is that what you call saving me? Shoving $38 million of dirty money into my account with Victoria so you guys can clear an SEC audit?" I shot back. He froze, completely blindsided that I had already connected the dots. His face twisted into a dark, ugly expression, as if his mask had been completely ripped off. He stared at me in total silence for 10 long seconds, then turned on his heel, got into a black sedan, and sped away. I stood alone in the empty parking lot, shaking all over. But I immediately uploaded the audio recording to Valerie's encrypted email. Within an hour, Valerie submitted the file to the U.S. Attorney's Office as concrete evidence of obstruction of justice and witness intimidation. The following Monday, Valerie called to tell me that Texas Interstellar Bank had been hit with a federal subpoena for every single record tied to my account. At the same time, a secondary subpoena had been served to the Delaware bank handling the paperwork for Apex Pioneer LLC. The massive gears of the federal government were finally turning. I was the one who pushed the button, and now the entire machine was roaring forward. After that, I took 4 days off. I didn't go anywhere. I just stayed home and stuck to my routine. But I forced myself to step away from the legal documents, the database searches, and the audio files. On Saturday, I went to the farmer's market. On Sunday, I had dinner with Maria. We didn't talk about the case once. Instead, I just listened to her ridiculous stories about the ER and laughed until my stomach hurt. Chief slept with his head on my lap. I sat on my back porch, watching the thin, golden November sunlight cross over the neighbor's fence, allowing myself to feel, just for a moment, like a person who was going to make it out of this in one piece. The offer came through Valerie's office. It was an official letter from a powerhouse law firm in Beverly Hills. Valerie recognized the firm immediately, calling it a boutique outfit that specialized in resolving sensitive financial friction through legal gray areas. She said it with a sharp, professional sarcasm. The letter was written in dense, incredibly precise legalese. It proposed a buyout of Evelyn Vance's historical spousal equity in Novatech. In exchange for signing a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement and withdrawing all reports and complaints filed with federal agencies regarding the October wire transfer, a sum of $4.5 million would be moved into any account of my choosing. The original $38,512,000 would then be legitimately recalled. The letter used the phrase collaborative resolution 7 different times, $4.5 million. I remember sitting at Valerie's conference table on a Wednesday morning reading that letter, and I remember exactly how it made me feel. It wasn't temptation, not exactly. It felt more like validation. I recognized the offer for what it truly was, the same way you recognize the shape of a trap someone warned you about. There it was. That was what they did when they were terrified. "They're trying to buy my silence," I said. "They're trying to buy your non-cooperation with an active federal investigation," Valerie corrected me, "which would make you guilty of obstruction of justice. They know this isn't a good faith offer. It's a test to see if you're the kind of person who has a price. If you take it, they have a documented paper trail proving you accepted a bribe to stop cooperating with the government." I stared at the letter for a few more seconds, then flipped it face down on the table. "Send it to the U.S. attorney," I said. Valerie gave me a small, precise smile. "I've already drafted the cover letter." After that, a strange period of silence set in. Arthur didn't show up again, and the lawyers in LA didn't send a follow-up. It was the heavy quiet of an enemy regrouping. Having spent 18 years in audit compliance, I knew this stillness wasn't peace. It was observation. They were watching from the shadows, waiting to see if I would blink. I didn't blink, but I was still human, and the weight of it was wearing on me. That was when I called David in Denver. David and I had worked together at the logistics firm for 8 years. He was a meticulous, almost paranoid guy who possessed a rare gift. He could just listen to you without jumping in to fix your emotions. I called him on a freezing Thursday night while sitting out on my back porch, and I laid out every single detail. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he asked, "Evelyn, do you have physical paper copies of everything?" It was such a David question to ask. He didn't ask if I was scared or how he could help me emotionally. He just wanted to know if my documentation was secure. "Yes," I told him. "Valerie has the originals, and I keep copies in a safe deposit box at a completely different bank." "Good," he said, pausing for a moment. "You know you're going to win this, right?" I didn't know that. I was hoping for it, but I had never allowed myself to say it out loud, and I hadn't heard anyone else say it either. Hearing it stated so plainly by someone who knew me inside and out hit a part of me that I had kept locked away tightly. "I'm not so sure," I admitted. "I am," he said. "I watched you work for 8 years. You are the most cautious, thorough person I've ever met. Whatever game they are playing, their entire plan was based on the assumption that you would either be compliant or stay invisible. They made a fatal mistake with you." The final explosion didn't happen in a courtroom. It happened during a mediation meeting forced through civil channels at Valerie's office. It was a last-ditch effort by the other side before the FBI closed in for good. My instinct was to refuse the meeting, but Valerie reluctantly agreed, believing it would force them to expose more evidence. I went because I trusted myself to hold the line. They arrived together. Arthur wore a dark designer suit, and Victoria wore an off-white cashmere coat that probably cost more than my 5-year car note. She was striking, with a sharp, predatory intelligence in her eyes. They sat across the table from us, wearing masks designed specifically for the occasion. Reasonable, deeply regretful, and entirely focused on clearing up a misunderstanding. Arthur spoke first. He said he was incredibly sorry things had escalated to this point. He said he wanted us to handle this as a family. He put a specific emphasis on the word family, trying to weaponize a bond that he had discarded years ago. He said he was confident we could find a solution that protected everyone, as long as I could make this stop. Stop the subpoenas, stop the investigation before things went too far. Then Victoria spoke. She was far more direct than Arthur, and significantly more dangerous. She completely skipped Arthur's clumsy attempt at an emotional appeal, and tried to create a sense of elite corporate sisterhood instead. "Evelyn," she said, leaning forward slightly, her tone sounding like a close friend sharing a secret. "I know what it feels like to be underestimated by arrogant men. I admire a woman who knows how to protect herself. I looked into your background. I know what the salary ceiling is for an auditor, and I know how brutal the property taxes in Texas can be. I genuinely want you to understand what $4.5 million in clean funds means for a woman in your position. It means absolute freedom. I saw right through it. It was the most sophisticated, vicious piece of psychological manipulation in the room. She wasn't just making an offer. She was reminding me of how small she thought my life was. She wanted me to believe that taking the money wasn't a compromise, but a smart business move. "I see exactly what you're doing," I said, looking her dead in the eye. They both went quiet. "You want me to feel small. You want me to believe that my life is too insignificant to survive this storm, and that the only practical, rational thing to do is take the payout and get out of your way." I moved my gaze from Victoria to Arthur. "The only reason you thought you could use me for this is because you assumed I could be pushed around and controlled. Arthur, it took me 8 years to fully see you for what you are. I should have seen it sooner, but I see it now." Arthur's face changed instantly. The fake, reasonable mask slipped away completely, the way a person tears it off when they realize it doesn't work anymore. "Evelyn," he said, his voice dropping every ounce of warmth, "you are nowhere near as safe as you think you are." "This meeting is over," Valerie's assistant said, standing up. They left. Arthur didn't look back, but Victoria held the door open for 1 extra second on her way out. She looked back at me across the room with an expression that was a mix of cold calculation and pure fury. She wanted me to know she was committing my face to memory, and that she had already passed judgment on me. Then, the door clicked shut. I sat in silence for a minute after the elevator doors closed downstairs. My heart was beating faster than I wanted it to. Arthur's threat and Victoria's freezing glare kept looping in my mind. I let them loop, and then I let them turn into pure fuel. I had sat in that room across from 2 powerful, arrogant predators, and I hadn't backed down an inch. I didn't flinch when Victoria picked apart my modest lifestyle, and I didn't fall for her trap of wrapping a bribe in the language of empowerment. On the drive home, I did feel fear, but it wasn't the fear of someone about to change course. It was the fear of someone who saw the exact size of the darkness she was fighting, and decided she was going to tear it down anyway. The federal interview was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in January at the IRS Criminal Investigation Field Office in Austin. It wasn't a trial, and it wasn't an arraignment. It was what the agents called a structured interview. I wasn't a suspect. I was the witness. 2 weeks ago, federal grand jury subpoenas were served to both Arthur and Victoria. They didn't have the right to refuse. To my slight satisfaction, they hired lawyers from completely different firms, meaning their united front was officially dead. Valerie spent 6 full weeks getting me ready. We weren't preparing for dramatic accusations. We were aiming for absolute precision. "You just state the facts in chronological order," she told me during our final run-through. "Let the documentation do the talking. No speculation and no personal emotion. The paper trail speaks for itself. Your job is simply to be the most bulletproof witness in that room." I wore a dark navy blazer and flats, carrying a thick binder. Inside was the timeline I had built piece by piece from October to January. Every call, every voicemail, every letter, every pacer filing, the dashcam footage of a sweating Arthur threatening me in the parking lot, the certified mail receipts, the buyout offer from the LA law firm that used the phrase collaborative resolution 7 times, and the SEC filings linking Victoria to the shell company. Everything was indexed, dated, and perfectly organized. I had spent 3 months building this fortress. It wasn't dramatic. It was a masterpiece of undeniable architecture. The interview started at 9:30 in the morning. The lead investigator was a special agent named Miller. She was in her late 50s, calm, unhurried, and possessed the quiet authority of someone who had heard thousands of lies and only cared about the truths that matched the paperwork. I went first. With my binder open in front of me, I handed over each piece of evidence as we moved along the timeline. Agent Miller asked 12 questions. I answered 11 of them with a document and 1 from memory. The whole interview took just 40 minutes. After that, they called Arthur and Victoria in. I wasn't allowed to stay for their questioning. Valerie and I sat out in the off-white hallway, drinking cheap coffee from a vending machine. The air smelled of copy paper and burnt coffee grounds. It struck me then that the rooms where the most defining moments of your life happen usually look just like any other boring corporate space. But I later learned what happened inside from Agent Miller's brief summary of the case. The Delaware bank records showed that the $38.5 million had been wired to Texas Interstellar Bank from an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. And according to seized server emails, The original intended recipient was never Evelyn Vance. It was Apex Pioneer LLC, a company Arthur had registered 3 months prior but had never funded. The routing number for that shell company on file with Texas Interstellar Bank was just a single digit off from my account number, 1 digit. The money had actually ended up in my account because of a clumsy data entry error by a low-level clerk, but the fatal detail was in the emails, which proved Victoria discovered the mistake within hours. Instead of correcting it, contacting the bank, or recalling the funds, she decided to wait and see. She intentionally left the money in my account, planning to use my clean tax history and my background as a senior auditor as a shield against an upcoming SEC audit. If investigators followed the trail, they would just find a real citizen with a spotless credit history, the perfect fall guy. When Victoria and Arthur were confronted with this evidence in the interrogation room, their stories completely collapsed. Arthur swore it was all Victoria's doing behind his back. Victoria screamed that the shell company was Arthur's idea, and that one of Arthur's employees had made the entry error. The precision with which they turned on each other could only come from 2 co-conspirators who had practiced their lies together, only to abandon each other the second the pressure got too high. Agent Miller asked them 3 follow-up questions each. Their answers missed each other on the timeline by a full 4 days. At 12:17 p.m., as Valerie and I walked toward the elevators, I tucked the binder under my arm. I felt something I hadn't felt since October, a clean, pure sense of relief that only comes when you tell the absolute truth and watch it stand tall. The federal justice system moves like any heavy government machine. It doesn't rush, but once it gets rolling, the momentum is completely unstoppable. The grand jury indictments came down at the end of the following March. Arthur Vance was charged with 3 felonies: wire fraud, conspiracy to commit money laundering, and obstruction of justice. Victoria was charged with 4 felonies: securities fraud, money laundering, conspiracy, and filing a fraudulent corporate registration containing material misstatements in the state of Delaware. Richard Collins, the smooth senior vice president from Texas Interstellar Bank, was indicted separately. He was charged with conspiracy before the fact and misprision of a felony. Texas Interstellar Bank was forced to sign a consent decree, placing them under strict federal supervision for 18 months, and they had to pay an $8.5 million civil penalty. They even had their CEO sign a formal letter of apology to me. Valerie framed it and hung it up in her conference table room, calling it what it looks like when arrogant financial giants blink first because you wouldn't back down. The $38,512,000 was legally stripped from my account in late November. My balance went right back to $4,219. Valerie's legal fees were incredibly high, but I paid every single cent without complaining. She was worth the price. When I handed her the final check, she gave me a copy of the indictment with a yellow sticky note that simply said, "You earned this." To this day, it sits in my filing cabinet at home alongside the certified mail receipts, the offer letter, and the dashcam backups. I haven't opened it since, which is the highest compliment I can pay it. The afternoon the indictments were announced, I sat in the kitchen with Chief at my feet, reading the Department of Justice press release on my phone. The release described the case in 2 incredibly dry sentences. The perpetrators utilized a misrouted wire transfer in an attempt to convert an unwitting account holder into a buffering entity for a money laundering operation. Upon receipt of the funds, the unwitting holder immediately reported the transaction to the proper authorities. The unwitting holder wasn't named. I read that phrase twice. Immediately reported the transaction to the proper authorities. That was all I did. That was my so-called heroism. I didn't spend the money, I didn't hide it, I didn't take the $4.5 million bribe, and I didn't let them intimidate me. I just did the right thing at a moment when it would have been incredibly easy to get lost, and somehow that adherence to the rules had become a rare quality. I just told the truth from the very first second, and kept repeating it through the silence on the line, the threats in the parking lot, the suffocating mediation meeting, and Victoria's arrogant gaze. As it turned out, that was enough. The quiet, everyday honesty of an ordinary person, when properly documented and delivered on time, can build a fortress much stronger than any empire built on lies. That night, David called me from Denver. "I told you so," he said. "Yes, you did," I admitted. "How does it feel?" I thought about it for a second. Chief shifted on the rug, letting out a long, contented sigh, perfectly secure in his place in the world. "It feels like myself," I said. "Completely and totally myself. On Saturday, Maria came over with a real bottle of French champagne and a bag of high-end ingredients for pasta. We cooked together in the kitchen and then sat by the window at the dining table to eat. The early winter sun hit the glass at a low angle, pouring across the tabletop. I realized something then. When you stand up to protect yourself, you aren't really protecting the money. I never wanted that $38.5 million. What I was protecting was this table, this sunlight, the friends around me, my dog, and the quiet, ordinary evenings that I had rightfully earned back. Arthur's trial took place in September. He was sentenced to 6 years in a federal prison. His tech company had already collapsed under the weight of federal scrutiny and investor withdrawals. Victoria was convicted in November and got 4 years. The judge specifically noted during sentencing that her decision to intentionally expose an innocent civilian to extreme federal legal danger after discovering the error was a chilling act of sacrificing someone else for personal gain. I didn't go to see the sentencing, but Valerie mailed me the transcripts. My own life took an unexpected turn, too. Valerie introduced me to a major tech company that was building out a top-tier anti-fraud compliance division. They were desperate for an auditing expert with real-world high-stakes experience. In June, I started as a senior risk consultant, more than doubling my old salary. The work is challenging, interesting, and uses every single skill I have ever learned. I stayed in the old brick house in Georgetown. In August, I put a new roof on it and painted the back porch a deep, rich terracotta red that I had been admiring in design magazines for years, but never felt I could justify. It looks absolutely perfect. In the fall, David came to Austin on a business trip. We walked along the Colorado River and talked about our new projects. That night, we sat on my red back porch, drinking some high-end whiskey he had brought with him. Chief patrolled the yard like an old night watchman, and the sound of Texas crickets hummed just beyond the fence line. "Do you think about it a lot?" David asked. "Less than I thought I would," I said. And that's the honest truth. What happened over that past year has become an experience that's been completely processed and integrated. It only comes alive when it needs to, but it doesn't intrude anymore. It changed me, pointing me toward clarity rather than leaving me broken. I've seen myself at both extremes now, the raw terror at the edge of the abyss, and the steady resolve of looking right into it. They coexist inside me in a strange, beautiful harmony, with no conflict at all. I've found that unique joy that only comes when you realize your life is still perfectly intact. Not because things didn't get incredibly tough, but because that brutal moment proved I was capable of surviving it. And survival itself revealed a hidden strength in me, something I probably wouldn't have noticed if I had spent another 20 years floating by. Looking back at that year, I learned 3 things. First, they target ordinary people for the simple reason that they assume ordinary people won't fight back. Second, inside a massive system specifically designed to disorient and confuse you, the most lethal counterattack you can make is to document everything and find an ally who understands the rules better than the people breaking them. And third, when they offer money to buy your silence and imply you're too small to ever win, those aren't immutable facts. Those are just tactics born out of their own desperation. If $38.5 million suddenly showed up in your bank account tomorrow, and a voice on the other end of the line told you it was absolutely not a mistake, what would you do? Hello everyone and welcome. I'm Arthur, and I am so glad you're here with me today. Please take a second to subscribe to the channel, give this audio a thumbs up, and drop a comment below to let me know what city you're listening from. It's always incredible to see just how far across the ocean these stories travel. People always ask me how I hit rock bottom, how I ended up buying a seemingly worthless abandoned storage locker for $500. The answer is simple, and it isn't pretty. I was completely broke. I was backed into a corner with absolutely nothing left. My name is Arthur Vance, and I'm 42 years old. 3 years ago, I was living in a damp motel room on the outskirts of Tacoma, Washington. I slept on a cheap mattress with worn-out springs and lived off discounted, expiring canned food from gas station convenience stores because it was cheaper than fast food. Before that, I had spent 12 years building a specialized mechanical workshop from the ground up, focusing on classic vintage cars and yacht restorations. But my own younger brother, who was also my business partner, secretly transferred our core patents behind my back, taking every single top-tier client and supplier contact with him. He left me with nothing but a hollow shell company and a non-compete agreement that his lawyers had cleverly engineered months in advance. I didn't have the money to fight him in court, so I walked away. My dad kept calling, begging me to move back to the family ranch in Montana, and my ex-wife would occasionally text me entry-level mechanic job openings at local auto shops out of pure pity. I always told them I was doing great, but the truth was I was drowning. I stumbled across the municipal maritime asset auction at 3 a.m. during a sleepless night, browsing through the local government's public notice website. When property owners stop paying long-term real estate taxes and maritime management fees, the city seizes the waterfront assets and puts them up for auction. Some plots are genuine investments, but most are total disasters. However, if you are willing to take on a truly abandoned piece of junk with title disputes, structural issues, or shady histories, the cost of entry is incredibly low. Old Boatyard Number 11, located in the Blackwood Harbor district of Bremerton, was the exact definition of a total disaster. It was a 1970s corrugated steel warehouse attached to a rotting wooden pier that stretched out into the Puget Sound. Its last registered owner was a man named Elias Cobb, who died of a heart attack back in 2018 without leaving a will, and the city could never track down a single legal heir. Kitsap County had been stuck with the property for 3 solid years. The starting bid at the auction was $500. On that rainy Tuesday morning, I was the only person in the room who raised a hand. That afternoon, I drove my beat-up Ford pickup over to check it out. It was November, and the Seattle rain was freezing, making the air smell entirely of wild ivy and salty seawater. It was the only part of this mess that offered any natural peace. The boatyard itself was a total wreck. The support pillars for the pier were severely eroded by the tide, and the windows facing the water were completely shattered, covered up by pieces of moldy plywood. The yard was overgrown with waist-high weeds and wild blackberry brambles that had almost swallowed the entire foundation. But the skeleton of the building was solid. I could see past the decay, the same way you can see the deep resilience hidden inside a person who has been through the ringer. The main steel beams weren't warped, the internal industrial crane tracks were still intact, and the concrete floor met load-bearing standards far beyond average buildings. I walked around the empty warehouse with a flashlight and a notepad, and by the time I stepped back out into the cold sea breeze, my mind was made up. I was going to restore it myself. With my years of mechanical restoration experience, I knew exactly what to do. I would live in it while I fixed it up, and once the transformation was complete, I'd sell it for a massive profit. The first few weeks were exactly what I expected. Exhausting, filthy, and entirely humbling. I tore down moldy office partitions, hauled out mountains of rusted cables, replaced damaged bolts on the steel beams, and spent a whole weekend using a pressure washer to blast away decades of heavy oil grease from the floors. It wasn't until Wednesday of the 4th week that I noticed something strange. I was inspecting an industrial-grade air compressor workbench in the deepest part of the warehouse. The workbench had been poured with heavy reinforced concrete directly into the ground. Out of habit, I tapped the base with a rust-scaling hammer, listening for any hollow echoes that might mean the internal rebar was rusting out. The left side of the workbench sounded dull and solid. The right side did too, but right in the dead center, in an area about 6 feet wide and 3 feet deep, the echo changed. It wasn't just a hollow sound. It felt like there was some kind of heavily insulated sealed independent chamber hidden directly beneath the floor. At first, I told myself it was probably just a vibration-dampening layer put in decades ago to handle heavy machinery. Old industrial buildings always have strange design quirks. I used that excuse to convince myself for 3 days, but on the 4th day, I brought out an industrial ground-penetrating radar unit, the kind I had rented specifically to inspect the pier's foundation. I slowly rolled the device across that patch of concrete and watched the readings on the screen jump wildly. It wasn't the density of a dampening material, it was the density of solid metal. A perfect rectangular metal outline with a hinge structure was buried 5 inches beneath the concrete. It was a hidden vault door. I walked back out to my truck and sat in the cold rain for a long time, staring at the gloomy warehouse through the windshield as the harbor fog began to roll in. What on earth was down there? To be completely honest, a part of me didn't want to find out. My gut, that survival instinct that usually senses danger long before your brain catches up, was telling me that whatever was hidden down there would completely upend my life. I had just survived a catastrophic change. and I didn't want any more wild cards. But I got out of the truck anyway and walked back inside. I grabbed an angle grinder and a sledgehammer, sliced through the sealed seams, smashed the top layer of concrete, and pried open that heavy, rust-resistant steel door. The space below wasn't large, about the size of a standard walk-in closet. There was no moldy odor, instead it smelled dry, carrying the scent of desiccant packs and oxidized brass. A blast-proof light fixture hung from the ceiling, wired directly into the warehouse's backup electrical grid, which meant someone had meticulously maintained this place for a long time. The floor was coated in a clean, waterproof finish, and stacked neatly in the farthest corner were 5 black, heavy-duty military cases. I swear to you it was the largest amount of wealth I had ever laid eyes on. I didn't count it that night. I couldn't. I just sat on the edge of that hidden vault, leaning against a cold steel beam with my heart hammering at a dangerous pace, staring blankly at those cases. It wasn't until I forced myself to stand up, take a deep breath, and look around the space again that I noticed the canister. It was a waterproof PVC engineering tube hanging on the moisture-proof board to my right. There was no label, no name, and certainly not mine. My hands shook as I unscrewed the cap, and a heavy cardstock note slid out. Written in black permanent marker with a stroke so aggressive it had actually torn through the paper, was a single word: leave. But I didn't leave. I want to make that completely clear, because in the days that followed, I asked myself 100 times why I didn't just turn around and run. Every single time I came to the exact same conclusion. Running away only works if you actually know what you're running from. At that moment, I knew nothing. All I had was a vault full of massive wealth, a warning note, and a property with a clean title that I had legally purchased for $500. Running away felt like walking away from a destiny I hadn't even had a chance to understand yet. I didn't sleep a wink that night. I did everything I could to cover the vault door back up, sliding the heavy metal plate of the workbench over it and stacking a few barrels of old motor oil in front. Then, I sat on a cold folding chair with a cup of black coffee that had gone completely cold, watching the high windows fade from pitch black to gray until the harsh November morning light of the Puget Sound finally broke through. I ran through every piece of information I had on Elias Cobb. It was a total blank. He died in 2018, spent the last decade of his life guarding this broken boatyard, and the city couldn't find a single relative. That was the entirety of the facts. First thing the next morning, I drove down to the Kitsap County Maritime Archives, not to a courthouse and not to a lawyer's office, but the archives. I wasn't ready to expose this secret to the world yet. I needed to think before I acted, and thinking requires information. The archivist was a serious, meticulous older African-American man who pulled the past 20 years of commercial port permits for me without asking a single unnecessary question, and I was incredibly grateful for that. I sat in front of a microfiche reader for 5 hours, flipping through endless, boring customs and logistics clearance declarations. Elias Cobb's name only appeared twice. Once in 2005, listed as a co-incorporator for a shell company called Deepwater Logistics to apply for an inspection-exempt status, and again in 2016, in an obituary mentioning that a Seattle shipping tycoon named Vincent Thorne had passed away from an illness, listing Elias Cobb as an old friend and advisor from his early startup days. Vincent Thorne. I wrote that name down. I also noted the name of the attorney who handled the exemption paperwork for that shell company back then, Elias Sterling. His firm was located in a luxurious commercial district in downtown Seattle. I drove back to the boatyard after dark. Pulling into the gravel yard, the building looked completely different to me now. It wasn't just a simple shelter anymore. It felt incredibly heavy, like a person carrying a lethal secret, desperately trying to hide the panic inside. The next day, I finally counted the contents. It took me an entire day. I was incredibly careful and systematic, which is how I handle everything when I'm terrified, because maintaining absolute precision is the only way I can hold on to a sense of control. I opened every single waterproof case, sorting the items neatly on a tarp laid out across the floor. Bundles of non-sequentially numbered older $100 bills, totaling $4.5 million. Along with the cash, there were 2 unmarked bags containing high-purity, uncut raw industrial diamonds, and dozens of vintage South African Krugerrand gold coins. I sat in front of that pile for a very long time. Nearly $5 million in assets, hidden away in a dead man's abandoned boatyard, and I had bought it from an oblivious county government for just $500. From a legal standpoint, I knew the ambiguity of this situation required extremely careful navigation. The building was mine, so legally, everything inside it should be mine too. But that should depended entirely on where this money came from, how it ended up hidden here, and whether there was anyone still breathing who had an illegal or lethal claim to it. The note said, "Leave," which meant this fortune was intentionally stashed here by someone who knew it would eventually be found. It meant this money had a history. And in my experience, history is always tied to dangerous people. The real question was who exactly? I knew I needed a lawyer, but it absolutely couldn't be Elias Sterling. He had history with Cobb, and until I figured out what kind of monster I was dealing with, I wasn't going anywhere near anyone who had past ties to this boatyard. I needed someone sharp, trustworthy, and completely disconnected from the county's good old boy network. I also knew I had to be incredibly disciplined about what I said and did. The second I told anyone about this, a lawyer, a friend, or my ex-wife, it would become an irreversible reality, both physically and legally. I had to be ready for that. So, I gave myself 3 days. 3 days to investigate, think, and put a plan together before taking my first official step. My plan was simple, broken down into 3 stages. First, establish a clear, undeniable legal record of the discovery. Time, location, and a detailed inventory. I needed to document it in a way that protected me and locked in an absolute timeline. Second, dig as deep as possible into the source of the funds to anticipate who might come looking for trouble and why. Third, go to Seattle and find a high-level attorney specializing in maritime law, asset forfeiture, and unclaimed property before saying a word to any local official. But during those 3 quiet days of prep, the one fatal variable I overlooked was that someone had been watching this boatyard for a long time. I didn't know it then, but I was about to find out real quick. The lawyer I found was named Evelyn Ross. She ran a private practice in Bellevue and had spent 10 years as an anti-money laundering and asset forfeiture prosecutor for the Department of Justice. Her website explicitly stated that she specialized in complex asset ownership disputes under non-standard conditions. I liked that phrasing. My situation was definitely non-standard, and its complexity was probably going to take a long time to unravel. On a Thursday morning, I parked my truck in a shopping center parking lot a few miles away from the boatyard to call her. I was starting to get this irrational feeling that the metal walls of the warehouse had ears. I told her everything. The auction, the $500, the sealed underground vault, the mountain of cash, the gold coins, the diamonds, and the card that read, "Leave." I spoke in a steady, even voice, and when I finished, the other end of the line went completely silent for a solid 30 seconds. "Are you in a safe location right now?" she asked. That was definitely not the first question I expected. "For now," I replied. "Good," she said. "Do not move any of the assets. Do not say another word to anyone. Meet me at my office tomorrow morning at 9. Evelyn Ross was an Asian woman in her late initiatives with eyes as sharp as a hawk. I later found out she had a heavy reputation in legal circles. Whenever other lawyers thought a case was too hot or too dangerous to touch, they sent their clients to her. In her office, I repeated the story in detail while she took extensive notes. When I wrapped up, she leaned back in her chair, studying me with the cold, calculated gaze of a combat medic. "Mr. Vance, you need to understand the legal reality here," she began, her voice low but carrying immense weight. "The legitimacy of this fortune is in a gray area. Because you legally acquired absolute title to the real estate through a municipal foreclosure auction, you have an incredibly strong initial claim to all unregistered property left inside the building. But," she raised a finger, "if this fortune is the proceeds of a crime, the game changes completely. The federal government can step in and initiate civil asset forfeiture. At the same time, victims of the original crime can file claims. This money only truly belongs to you if you can prove it was just legally saved or hidden, or at least prove that no one else can make a legally valid claim to it." Her first strategic order was for me to immediately file a formal, written discovery report with the Kitsap County Sheriff's Office and the Coast Guard sector. It wasn't because the law strictly required me to do it right that second, but to create a legal firewall with an official timestamp. If some thugs accuse you of pocketing their dirty money down the road, you need a perfect paper trail showing you went straight to law enforcement the moment you formed a preliminary plan. That afternoon, I went to the Kitsap County Sheriff's Office to file the report. The young deputy who took my information was visibly out of his depth when I described the massive amount of money involved. He made a few phone calls, and within an hour I was sitting across from Sheriff Marcus Flynn. Flynn was a lean, older man close to retirement, carrying a weathered calm that made me feel strangely at ease. He took the report incredibly seriously. He personally accompanied me back to the boatyard, bringing along 2 of his most trusted deputies. They inspected the vault, took photos, and logged samples and serial numbers of the cash and items in the cases. Just as the vault was being resealed, Flynn stood in that dry, metallic-smelling air, looked at me, and said something that made my blood run cold. "You know what's interesting, Vance? 5 years ago, around the end of 2016, we got an anonymous tip about this exact address. The caller claimed there was a massive stash of smuggled cash here. We came out with a warrant and tore the place apart, but back then, there were 5 or 6 heavy marine engines stacked right on top of this concrete section. We found nothing and had to close the case." He paused, his deep eyes locking onto mine. "Looks like we missed the headline back then. Someone had called the cops in 2016. That was 2 years before the previous owner, Cobb, died. Which meant the caller definitely wasn't Cobb himself, or some random stranger. It was an insider, someone trying to use the police to rip that money away from Cobb or force him to move it. And that attempt had failed. Who could it be? That night, even with the freezing rain hitting my face, I kept my truck windows rolled down on the drive back to the boatyard because I needed the biting cold to keep my head clear. As I pulled into the yard before I even turned off the engine, my phone buzzed on the passenger seat. It was a text from an unknown number. "We know what you found. What belongs to the family stays with the family. Don't be stupid." I didn't reply. I took a screenshot, forwarded it to Evelyn, and called Sheriff Flynn. Early the next morning, Evelyn called me back with fresh intelligence. She had used her contacts at the Federal Corporate Registry to pull the complete ownership history of that old shell company, Deepwater Logistics. The company had been incorporated back in 1998, and the real players pulling the strings were just 2 men, Elias Cobb and Vincent Thorne. And when Vincent passed away in 2016, his massive commercial empire was completely taken over by his stepson, the current shipping and logistics mogul Victor Thorne. With that connection, all the pieces started falling into place. Victor Thorne. I had my first direct adversary, and I had my first real lead. And the shadow in the dark knew I had it. Now there was no turning back. Once Victor Thorne's name was confirmed, Evelyn moved like lightning. The very next day, she went to federal court to file for an emergency injunction, requesting that the massive assets be placed into a court-monitored trust account until the title dispute was resolved. At the same time, she officially submitted the threatening text message to the state attorney's office. The prosecutor showed immense interest in it. The text had been sent from an untraceable burner phone, which sent us a crystal-clear signal. The sender wasn't acting on a whim. They had practiced this. This wasn't just a backup plan, it was standard operating procedure for a mature criminal organization responding to a crisis. For the next few days, I was either staying at Evelyn's firm or sleeping in a cheap motel in Tacoma. Evelyn strictly warned me not to spend the night at the boatyard until we figured out our opponent's hand. I didn't try to play the tough guy or refuse. I understood the value of fear perfectly. Fear kept me incredibly precise. According to Evelyn's background check, Victor Thorne was 52 years old, a local Seattle oligarch who outwardly operated legitimate ocean cargo shipping lines covering the entire West Coast. But to those in the know, his rise to power was a trail of dirty acquisitions and violent out-of-court settlements. He was an expert at using offshore trusts and maze-like corporate structures. And to no one's surprise, his chief legal counsel was none other than Elias Sterling, the lawyer who handled the shell company paperwork back in the day. The exact same lawyer my gut told me to avoid from the very beginning. Turns out my intuition saved my life. One afternoon in the firm's conference room, Evelyn laid out our working cards over a cup of black coffee. Our current working assumption is, and remember, this is just an assumption, that Cobb and the elder Thorne used the boatyard for illegal smuggling back in the day, likely high-tariff electronic components or a money laundering operation. This massive pile of cash and hard currency that couldn't easily be banked is the evidence. When the older Thorne died in 2016, Victor, as the stepson, naturally assumed he would inherit this black fund. But Cobb refused to hand over the assets, denying the money even existed. Victor was backed into a corner because you can't exactly go to court to sue for a split of criminal funds you can't legally account for. So Victor made that anonymous call to the cops in 2016, I chimed in. He wanted law enforcement to raid the place. If the money was exposed, maybe he could pull some strings as an interested party to get a piece back, or maybe he just wanted to force Cobb to move it so he could hijack the transfer. Exactly. But the police found nothing because Cobb had completely sealed it beneath the concrete, Evelyn said with a cold laugh. Then Cobb died unexpectedly in 2018. The boatyard fell into a tidal vacuum, and Victor just had to wait like a patient predator for the county auction, planning to legally buy the land himself. And then I showed up and blindsided him for $500. I let that reality sink in. A cold, calculating tycoon who had been waiting years to pocket millions had just watched a broke, unknown mechanic walk in and steal the entire vault for the price of a few tires. That night my phone rang. Unknown number. I hit accept and record simultaneously, following Evelyn's instructions to document every single point of contact. The voice on the other end was deep and smooth, carrying the distinct arrogance of someone who spent his whole life giving orders. "Mr. Vance," the voice said, "this is Victor Thorne. I think it's time we had an adult conversation." I stayed silent. "The funds in that building were a business reserve left by my late father," he continued, his tone humming with a controlled threat. "There is a private internal agreement proving my family has absolute authority over it. I'm not asking for anything that isn't mine. I'm just asking you to show a little common sense and cooperate." "Talk to my lawyer," I said, and hung up right in his face. I forwarded the audio file to Evelyn instantly. Then I sat on the edge of my motel bed, letting the adrenaline fade as a wave of tremors washed over my body. I made a rule for myself right then and there. I was allowed to be terrified for 5 minutes. 5 minutes of purely physical shaking, and then back to logic, back to work. Evelyn called back an hour later. "He's going to escalate," she warned. "He doesn't have a shred of legally binding evidence that would stand up in court, otherwise he would have sued you already. That means he's going to take things underground. Be ready." She was right. 3 days later, when I went back to the boatyard during the day to grab a set of my precision drills, I found a hole crudely torched into the side of the corrugated steel wall with an acetylene cutter. They hadn't stolen any of my expensive tools. The vault where the money had been hidden was already empty and sealed by the court. But someone had meticulously rifled through every single piece of paper in my makeshift office. Every receipt, every copy of the purchase agreement, even my mechanical repair blueprints. They were hunting for something. A silver bullet to use against me. I called the police right away, notified Evelyn, and photographed every detail of the break-in. Then I drove over to a diner off I-5 and ordered a large black coffee. I needed to think. Why would Victor risk a felony break-in? What did he think I had? The answer came to me slowly through the haze of exhaustion and stress. He needed to find out if I had uncovered the private internal agreement he mentioned on the phone. If that document actually existed and I found it, it was a double-edged sword. It could either back up his claim, or it would completely expose the criminal foundations of his father's empire and his current business. I didn't have the agreement. But now I knew exactly where to look. Following our plan, I took another 3 days off after that. I stayed in my motel room, caught up on sleep, watched mind-numbing TV, and called my ex-wife. I didn't tell her anything specific. I just listened to her complain about Tacoma traffic for a bit. It was exactly what I needed to stop my nerves from frying. 3 days later, I went right back to the battlefield. The next few days were strangely quiet. No unknown numbers calling, no drones buzzing the property, no more break-ins at the boatyard. Evelyn had warned me that when a guy like Victor Thorne, someone who survived corporate warfare, goes quiet after a failed attempt at intimidation, it doesn't mean he's backing down. It means he's calculating a more lethal angle. They were watching from the shadows, and I was going to use that window of time. On a Monday morning, I walked back into the boatyard with a completely new objective. I wasn't a mechanic anymore. I was a forensic archaeologist. I began searching every single inch of that place, trying to figure out where a man meticulous enough to bury millions in a concrete floor would hide a lethal paper trail. I tore into the wiring boxes, pulled the filters out of the ventilation ducts, and even checked the seams of the crane operator's seat. I spent a whole morning ripping through the second-floor loft, coming up empty. It wasn't until Wednesday afternoon, while I was tearing down the massive industrial air compressor I originally planned to restore, that I found it. Hidden inside the core of the 200-gallon pressure tank was a waterproof titanium tube welded directly to the interior wall. Inside were several rolls of yellowed microfiche and a handwritten document wrapped in heavy parchment paper. The document was 6 pages long, dated back to 1998, and carried the signatures of Elias Cobb and Vincent Thorne at the bottom. It was an ironclad confession of smuggling. The paperwork detailed exactly how they utilized Deepwater Logistics inspection-exempt status to bring high-value, undeclared industrial chips and black-market gold into the country and flip them for cash. The agreement clearly laid out the profit split, 60% to Cobb, 40% to Thorne. But the absolute silver bullet was the very last clause. Upon the death of either partner, the operation would terminate immediately, and all hidden, undistributed assets would automatically and entirely belong to the surviving partner, completely bypassing any family inheritance. That was Victor's fatal flaw. According to the illicit agreement his own father signed, the moment the elder Thorne died in 2016, the entirety of that money legally, at least by black market rules, belonged to Cobb. And with Cobb dying with no heirs in 2018, that fortune was entirely abandoned property sealed within the building. I sat there next to the oil-scented compressor, watching a cargo ship slide across the gray waters of the Sound. Did I feel a massive wave of relief? Yes. But I also knew that what I held in my hands was a signed confession capable of triggering a federal money laundering storm. I took high-resolution photos of every single page and sent them straight to Evelyn. She went completely silent on the line for a full minute. "Arthur," she said, a hint of excitement creeping into her voice, "this isn't just a game changer. This is a nuclear bomb. The U.S. attorney is going to salivate over this document, but it also means your claim to the money is about to be dragged into a massive Department of Justice investigation." "I get it," I replied calmly. I had been weighing the cost all afternoon. "There is a play here," Evelyn said, choosing her words carefully. "If you cooperate fully as a good-faith purchaser and turn this over as state's evidence against the Thorne money laundering network, we can use it as leverage to prevent a full forfeiture of the assets you discovered. It's not a 100% guarantee, but it's our strongest hand. As for Victor Thorne," she continued, "the second this document hits the prosecutor's desk, he loses any shred of a legitimate claim. And he's looking at federal indictments for attempting to claim, conceal, and intimidate someone over criminal assets." I felt a weight settle deep in my chest. It wasn't the euphoria of winning. It was way too early for that. But it was that cold, steady calm that comes when you stop taking hits and finally get your hands on the weapon to fight back. 2 days later, we met with Assistant U.S. Attorney Sarah Chen in a secured conference room at the Seattle Federal Building. She was a sharp, no-nonsense prosecutor. I handed over the original agreement, the photos, the recordings of Victor, the police report from the break-in, and the screenshots of the threatening text. She didn't make any grand promises, simply stating, "We'll be in touch." Walking out of the federal building into a rare splash of winter Seattle sunshine, I suddenly craved normal life. I called my old buddy Martin from the auto shop days, the only guy who lent me cash when I went broke. I took him out for a massive dinner at a noisy steakhouse. I didn't give him any specific details, but I let him know I was finally about to pull through. "You're a tough son of a gun, Arthur," Martin said, raising his beer glass. "I'm not tough," I smiled. "I'm just stubborn." It was the first time in months I had actually laughed out loud. It felt like breaking the surface for a massive breath of air after being held underwater for way too long. Victor Thorne showed up in person on a Saturday morning. By then, I had moved back into the temporary office at the boatyard. Evelyn had confirmed that the funds were officially moved into a secure federal escrow account, meaning any direct physical threat to me was completely pointless. My restoration work was moving along nicely. The mornings on the Puget Sound were beautiful, and the process of restoring rusted metal became the perfect way to clear my head. At 9:30, a black Mercedes G-Wagon pulled into the gravel yard. Victor Thorne stepped out, wearing a tailored cashmere coat, carrying himself with that polished, PR-trained composure. Walking next to him was a man in a sharp suit wearing gold-rimmed glasses, his attorney, Elias Sterling. A massive, cold-eyed head of security followed closely behind them. I stood at the end of the pier holding a heavy adjustable wrench, making no move to invite them inside. "Mr. Vance," Victor said, his voice carrying a fake, practiced warmth. "I want to apologize for the unpleasantness from before. I came out here personally today to clear up some misunderstandings. We'd like to speak with you openly and honestly." Next to him, Sterling adjusted his glasses and chimed in, using a tone that was almost pitying. Mr. Thorne has always deeply valued the lifelong friendship between his father and Mr. Cobb. It pains him to see this situation become so adversarial. I didn't say a word. I knew that in a confrontation like this, silence is far more heavy and intimidating than any speech. To be completely frank, Victor continued, shifting his tone to sound incredibly sincere and reasonable, my father poured his entire life's work into that enterprise. The assets in that vault are, for the most part, the direct result of his hard work. I fully understand that the current legal definition is a bit muddy, but on a moral level, he gestured with his hands, I believe you're a reasonable man. Rather than destroying each other, we should come to a civilized arrangement. Morals. When these predators realize their legal weapons are useless, they always love to hide behind morals. We don't need all of it, Sterling said, taking a small step forward as if he were handing out charity. Just 30%. A private, confidential settlement agreement. You won't face any more pressure from legal lawsuits, no underworld elements, no endless trouble. You keep the boatyard and the lion's share of the wealth, and we all go our separate ways. I stared into Victor's eyes for a long time while the sea breeze whipped against my collar. You know what the most moral part of this whole thing is to me? I said, my voice sounding colder and steadier than I ever expected. It's the fact that you actually have the nerve to stand on my property and pitch me this deal. Just this week, Mr. Sterling filed a motion with the district court, trying to use trade secrets as an excuse to block any historical partnership documents from being used as evidence. The polished mask of composure on Victor's face tightened for a fraction of a second. Those are two completely different things, Victor said, his voice hardening. No, it's the exact same thing, I said, tightening my grip on the heavy wrench. If you actually believed you had a legitimate legal or moral claim, you'd be making it out in the open in a courtroom. You're only standing here because your legal team told you that you don't stand a chance in front of a judge. I am not interested in any private arrangements designed to cover up your looming legal defeat. The head of security took a step forward, his eyes turning vicious. You're making a massive mistake, he growled under his breath. Mr. Thorne has resources on the West Coast you can't even fathom. Around this harbor, strangers who make enemies with the wrong people usually don't end up well. That's enough, Victor snapped, cutting his man off immediately, but the civilized veneer was completely shattered. We both knew exactly where we stood now. Get off my property, I said. Victor gave me one last look, a freezing glare packed with pure, unspoken malice. Then he gave a slight nod, turned on his heel and walked back to the car. I stood out in the cold wind for a long time, watching the Mercedes vanish down the highway. My heart was still hammering against my ribs, but my hands were completely steady. I had anticipated their arrival, and I had even expected this exact good cop, bad cop routine. But I hadn't expected that once I saw through the weakness behind their massive machine, the whole thing would look so completely transparent. The security chief's threat carried a lot of weight. Victor had immense local influence, and I was completely on my own. But during those past few months, I had learned the most important lesson of all. Fear is not the opposite of resolve. If you know how to harness it, fear is the most potent fuel on earth. I could feel it burning in my veins right then, making my vision incredibly sharp. I called Evelyn and repeated the entire conversation word for word, making sure to highlight the security chief's final threat. Perfect, Evelyn said, a rare note of triumph in her voice. That is absolutely perfect for us. It didn't exactly feel perfect from where I was standing. You'll see, she explained. Showing up in person to apply pressure with an explicit threat of violence, combined with the paper trail we already submitted, is the exact behavioral pattern a federal prosecutor dreams of. It tells the feds that this isn't a wronged family seeking legitimate legal recourse. This is a mafia empire using mob tactics to protect a criminal network and intimidate a private citizen. I hung up, walked back into the office, and poured myself a stiff drink. The wild blackberry brambles were still clawing at the windows outside, but the main structure of the boatyard was completely transformed. How much longer? I asked Evelyn over the phone. We're counting in weeks, not months, she replied. The net is closing in. The federal grand jury hearing that would decide our fates was scheduled for the following January. By then, prosecutor Sarah Chen's investigation had been running secretly for 2 solid months. Evelyn told me, in that vague but loaded way lawyers speak when they don't want to leave a paper trail, that the government's harvest was incredibly bountiful. It wasn't until I sat in that courtroom that I truly understood what that bounty meant. Right before the hearing, Sarah Chen officially slapped Victor Thorne and several of his associates with massive federal felony indictments covering racketeering, obstruction of justice, and interstate money laundering. Sterling's motion to suppress the handwritten profit-sharing agreement was flatly denied by the federal judge. At the same time, forensic accountants hired by the Department of Justice had spent weeks reverse-tracking the serial numbers on the cash I discovered, pulling endless offshore account records. The conclusion was fascinating. A portion of that $4.5 million in cash and currency could be directly tied to specific smuggling runs. But another portion, as the report put it in dry official terms, due to the passage of time and concealed methodologies, cannot be exclusively linked to any specific known criminal activity. In other words, some of the money was too dirty to ever clean, but under a legal microscope, some of it was technically untainted. That day, I sat in the gallery wearing a dark gray suit I bought from a thrift store, which I had ironed flat the night before. I felt completely at peace. It wasn't a forced calm, but that deep, bone-deep tranquility that settles in when you've done absolutely everything in your power and you're ready for whatever comes next. Victor Thorne sat at the defense table, still looking impeccably groomed. He wore that specific expression reserved for powerful men, acting as if he were merely caught up in a ridiculous administrative misunderstanding, patiently waiting for it to be cleared up. That poise had always been his favorite armor. Even though this hearing didn't directly decide who got the assets, that would require a separate civil hearing later on, it was the foundation for everything. Sarah Chen coldly and systematically laid out the chain of evidence for the judge: the auction records, the legal police discovery report, the threatening text message, the crime scene analysis from the break-in, the smuggling agreement hidden in the compressor, and the audio recording of Victor showing up with his security chief to threaten me. And then, she dropped a depth charge that even I didn't see coming. She called a witness named Frank Doyle, 70 years old, the former port scheduling supervisor for Bremerton, now under full federal criminal immunity. Taking the stand, Doyle detailed exactly how Cobb and the elder Thorne used cargo ships to smuggle illicit goods and settle the transactions in cash from 1998 all the way through 2012. He identified the elder Thorne as the primary contact, and he pointed directly at Elias Sterling as the shell company architect who built the money laundering pipelines. Sitting at the defense table, Sterling went completely pale. Victor turned his head, whispering something furious through gritted teeth to his lawyer. Sterling gave a barely noticeable shake of his head. Then, Prosecutor Chen added coldly, "Your Honor, the government wishes to submit internal email records from another immunized witness showing that Victor Thorne had full material knowledge of his father's smuggling and laundering network as early as 2014, and in 2015, personally directed a sum of roughly $150,000 of those illicit proceeds into his current real estate ventures. This constitutes a continuous receipt of criminal gains." Victor's arrogant mask didn't break, but I could see the muscles in his jaw twitching. That high and mighty composure instantly hardened into the stiff panic of a trapped animal. Sterling tried to stand up and object, stammering, "Your Honor, my client completely denies—" "Mr. Sterling," the judge interrupted sharply, "given the evidence presented this morning, I am referring your firm to the State Bar Association's Ethics Committee for immediate investigation. Your firm's historical role in structuring shell companies for a smuggling operation creates an irreconcilable conflict of interest, if not outright complicity, with your role as defense counsel today. Do I make myself clear?" "Yes, Your Honor," Sterling said, slumping back into his chair. I looked over at Victor Thorne. He was staring straight ahead, his jaw locked tight. The armor was still there, but it was shattered wide open, and everyone in the room could see the rot hiding underneath. Over the months following that hearing, the wheels of the legal system ground forward with their trademark slow, merciless rhythm. Sterling was forced to withdraw from Victor's defense team a week later, immediately facing a state bar investigation to revoke his license. Victor spent a fortune hiring a powerhouse fixer attorney from Los Angeles, desperately trying to scramble for a plea bargain. But with ironclad evidence on the table, there wasn't much room to negotiate. The criminal case against Victor Thorne was unstoppable: witness intimidation, harboring a criminal enterprise, and receiving illicit organization funds. The port supervisor's testimony was completely bulletproof. Victor's new lawyer tried to argue that his client had no idea about his father's historical dealings, but the time-stamped emails and the money trails made that defense look completely hollow. After a long, drawn-out legal battle, Victor Thorne pled guilty the following spring to 1 count of federal tax fraud and 1 count of receiving illicit funds. He was sentenced to 5 years in a federal prison, which was suspended to 3 years of probation and hit with a massive $8 million fine in restitution. He didn't serve active time inside a cell. At first, I felt a deep sense of injustice about that. It felt like the terror he put me through didn't balance out with the punishment he received.